So Emperor Julian was well known for criticizing the early Christians, but even more, he criticized his own people, the Romans, in the 300s, because they did not care for the poor like the first Christians did. He wrote about their suffering, and he said, "These impious Galileans," and he was speaking of the Christians, "support not only their poor, but ours as well." A couple hundred years before him, there was a man named Lucian, a playwright, who wrote, "The earnestness with which the people of this religion help one another in their needs is incredible. They spare themselves nothing for this end." You can see how far they were willing to go. Even before him, there was a man named Pliny the Younger. Quite the name, right? Pliny the Younger. He was an official. He was a lawyer and then later a magistrate or a local official in Rome. And he wrote to his emperor talking about the lengths to which he would go to persecute or to go after the Christians. And he commented about their character. And he spoke actually something really pretty complimentary about the Christians' character. He said, "Meanwhile, in the case of those who were denounced to me as Christians, this is what I did. I had this procedure. I interrogated them. And those who confessed to being Christians, I interrogated both a second and a third time, threatening them with punishment. And those who persisted, I executed, or I ordered executed. I had no doubt, whatever the nature of their creed, their stubbornness and their inflexible obstinacy surely deserved to be punished." So what were the early Christians known for, according to Pliny? They were well known for being obstinate in their confession. They would not bend. Marcus Aurelius, he wrote something similar about the first Christians. He was one of the last great emperors of the Roman Empire. And he too praised Christians for their steadfast commitment. He said, when he was talking about death, "What a soul that is which ready, at any moment it must be separated from the body, and rather ready either to be extinguished or dispersed, or to continue to exist, but so that this readiness comes from a man's own judgment, not just from obstinacy as the Christians have." So he was actually criticizing the Christians for their obstinacy, but what he really noticed about them was their obstinacy. And all of that is the same kind of sentiment or another part of the character that was reflected by the man Luke as he wrote in Acts. He said, "The apostles left the Sanhedrin rejoicing because they had been counted worthy of suffering disgrace for the name." Now, maybe because of the variety of quotes I put together there, you missed kind of the overall gist. But the gist was, even though the first Romans found plenty to criticize in the early Christians, they also couldn't help but using them as examples for their own people because they were so good at suffering. They would put up with anything. They went to great lengths to care for the poor, and not just care for the Christian poor, but care for the unbelieving poor. Such great lengths that they would experience great pains themselves. Right? They were obstinate. Obstinate. You don't really compliment your kids and call them obstinate, but the Christians were obstinate in the face of accusations and trial. When they were accused of being Christians, they would not give up their confession. The Christians even rejoiced because they were suffering for Christ. They were known. They had a good mark, a good reputation in the ancient world for their suffering. And it makes me wonder, how good are you and I at suffering? We suffer in different ways than they did, right? But how good are we at suffering? How good are you at suffering? It's very difficult to suffer in America. Dr. Paul Brand was a surgeon, an orthopedic surgeon, and he treated leprosy patients. And so he spent a lot of time in India treating leprosy patients. He commented one of the things he noticed as he came back to the United States later in his career, that in the United States he encountered a society that seeks to avoid pain at all costs. Patients lived at a greater comfort level than any I had previously treated, but they seemed far less equipped to handle suffering and far more traumatized by it. Suffering can really mess us up, and Paul is pointing out, our culture, it's perhaps not very good at suffering. How are you at suffering? Do you exhibit joy when you have sorrow? Not that you bland over or push away the sorrow, but that you have joy alongside the sorrow. Do you have a firm commitment, an obstinacy almost, when you face sorrow and pain and suffering? Even though you face suffering and pain and suffering, right? You can do both at the same time. This is the character, right, that you and I should have as we suffer. And as we look at the book of Acts over these weeks, today we want to ask this question, right? Why does God let us have all of this suffering? Especially if Jesus has risen from the dead. Why doesn't he just take it all away? So, first question is, do we have to suffer? Do we have to deal with suffering? Can't we just get rid of it? Can't we just eliminate it, not think about it? And this along the way also helps us ask or think about what suffering is. One of the first miracles that happened after Jesus ascended into heaven and then sent the Holy Spirit to his people, Peter and John were walking into the temple. There was a man there who was lame. He had been unable to walk for many years. And Peter looked straight at him and he said to him, "Silver or gold I do not have, but what I do have I give you. In the name of Jesus Christ of Nazareth, walk." Now, this is a helpful example because it says what we tend to look for as we fix and face suffering is what? Money, or other solutions, quick and easy solutions for our problems. Peter says, obviously the real solution for our suffering is Christ. Along the way, this helps us kind of address and think about what suffering is. What did this man experience as he lived a lame life? Have you ever busted your leg up for a while and been unable to walk? Or maybe just fallen on it? I fell on my knee a few weeks ago pretty hard, and I spent a good couple of days hobbling around. Suffering, it's pain, right? It's certainly physical pain. And there's a philosopher, Max, he says, yes, pain is part of suffering. And in suffering, pain is real pain, but it's also misery. Right? When I busted up my knee, I wasn't just in pain, I was kind of mopey all the time because I couldn't do any of the things that I usually wanted to do. And that's part of suffering as well. Suffering is very difficult to define. It's difficult to say this is exactly what suffering is. But this is a helpful way to look at it. What philosopher Max says. He says pain in suffering is actually pain. And pain is actually also misery. It's the sorrow and the trials that you experience in it. And you do that because that way pleasure is actually pleasure. Right? It's saying that the reality of what a thing is actually what it is. It is actually pain, and so that there is actually pleasure. That is suffering. Now, the best description, right, of suffering probably comes from Jesus as he goes through the Garden of Gethsemane. He says, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death." We talk about this sometimes. We say, I've got a heartache or heartbreak because my girlfriend dumped me. I felt that one time in my life. And you think, can you really have emotional pain to the extent that your own physical heart breaks? Sure. And Jesus says, I've gone all the way to the point of death. Why? Not because I'm dying, but because my soul has such anguish in it. That's suffering, right? It's the combination of emotional anguish and physical pain. And Peter shows us here as he deals with this man in Acts that that's something that we need to leave God in our lives so that we can think about or so we can fix it. Getting rid of God out of our lives doesn't make it any better. Look at the modern alternatives, and I know that this is going quick, but look at the modern alternatives to a Christian thought on suffering. Here's just two quick and easy ones. The one kind of idea that we see often in life is a sort of karma idea, that you get what you deserve. So if you suffer in your life, well, it's just payback. It's your comeuppance because you did something wrong. And maybe you've had people say something to you like that. Oh, well, this is just, I'm getting what I deserve in life because I messed up. I was a bad person and I did those terrible things as a child, and so now I'm just getting my comeuppance. Right? There's that idea of running around in life, that suffering is what we deserve because we messed up. But the other way to look at suffering is that there is no answer for it. There is no cause for it. That you and I, we live in what's often called, right, a secular world. A world without God, and a world where everything has a natural cause. Right? So naturalism is the reason for everything. And in this idea then of chaos, suffering is simply this interruption to our lives. It's just this problem that blips on the screen that we need to get rid of. Richard Dawkins commented about how suffering was simply the reality that we live in a world that has an evolutionary direction to it. It's just what happens as out of the normal chaos of our lives. Now, are either of those views really the views that would lead us to a good understanding or a good use of suffering in our lives? See, in Christianity, the idea is that more so that suffering is a normal experience of sin, and that it exposes this big disconnect in our lives. That suffering is something that opens us up, or it alerts us to the reality that you and I, we want something so much more than this life. We know that we're supposed to live forever. And so when we get cancer and we start crying about it, right, we're thinking about what's supposed to be. We know that life is supposed to be coming out of our lives. And so when our child dies from a miscarriage or some other tragic event, we say, where is the life? We know that we're made for love and for connection. And so when we experience a disconnect, when we get dumped, we say, why doesn't anybody love me and care about me? Right? Over and over we go through our lives and we run into all of these events, and we could say about them, well, I just deserve to get dumped. I was a crappy boyfriend. I was a crappy girlfriend. I ought to get dumped. This is what I get. This is my comeuppance. Or we could say, this is not supposed to happen. This is just chaotic mess, and I need to get it out of my life. Or we say, as the Christian view says, hey, suffering is getting dumped. It reveals for me a truth that in this world, there's always going to be a distance, a space between the love that I experience with somebody else and what I'm really looking for is the ultimate love with God. That's the Christian truth of suffering, and that's why it's so important that you and I leave God in the question of suffering. That's why we have to say every time you and I get cancer, or we go through a great loss in our lives, we lose our jobs, we have friends that can't hardly put up with us anymore. Why we have to say to ourselves, what is God doing in this mess? What is God doing in this problem? What is God doing for us in this pain? Christianity is convinced that God is using, just like Peter and John found with that lame man, God is using the suffering or allowing the suffering to illustrate the distance between us and the glory that He wants for us. One way to illustrate it, to think about it a little bit, and I was thinking about this as I thought about moms today, is to think about the idea of, imagine two women. Imagine that we've got two women, and one has kids and one has no kids. Now, both can live life just fine. You can have a full and rich life without kids, and you could have a full and rich life with kids. And maybe one of them regrets either having kids or not having kids, right? We're not going to talk about that. The question just to ask is to say, does having the kids in life make it easier to answer all of the hard questions of existence? If we just said people came from a stork, would it be easier for you and I to answer why it's so important that we sacrifice for others? If we just said people magically pop into existence and we didn't have to have kids, but they just poof, 32 years old, would it be easier to answer why we have to spend so much time teaching somebody patience, using patience to instruct them? See, I would argue to you that getting rid of having kids, the experience of having kids, wouldn't make it easier for us to explain the realities of our lives. It wouldn't make anything any more fun or enjoyable to be able to say, well, storks just drop off everybody that shows up into existence. We would still then say, well, why do we have to spend all of this time in patient instruction in our lives? And in the same way, it's so vital for you and I to keep God in the question even of suffering. Because without God in the question of suffering, there's no way you can ever find a hopeful answer in any of the problems. That's the first thing that you and I really need to do, is we need to learn to keep God in the questions of our suffering, of all of our lives. Even if it's a little thing, like I lost my job. To not blame it on God and not excuse God, but not just say this is the chaos of life, and instead ask, what is God doing with this event? What is God allowing to happen with this event? What is God working in me through this experience? What is God showing me? That's the first thing that we need to do. We need to keep God in our suffering. Now let's imagine that you say, okay, I'm going to keep God in my suffering. What's it going to look real quickly if you and I learn how to suffer well? Well, we can look through the book of Acts and we see what the Christians did and how they suffered well. For example, you're going to learn to deal with suffering. You're going to even expect it in our lives. Jesus said to Paul, I will show him how much he must suffer for my name. Second, you're going to learn to rejoice in suffering. Right? The first Christians, they left the Sanhedrin rejoicing because they had been counted worthy of suffering disgrace. Now, I know what the big thing that is. How can you say, I just lost my job and I'm filled with joy? That's a really hard thing to say. But that is what Christians learn to do, because we learn to say, God must be doing something good for me in this event. We also learn to lament. We pray in our suffering. The first thing that you and I should always do whenever we experience suffering and problems and trials is to say, God, help us. God, save us. God, come and rescue us. If I find one problem we all have, is that our default reaction when we experience suffering is either to discard it, to say, this is just the chaos of our lives, or to blame it on ourselves, but not to open our hands up and say, God, come and save us. Come and rescue us. That's what we need to do. Another mark that we see from the first Christians comes from the Apostle Paul in Romans, where he writes that not only so, but we also glory in our sufferings, because we know that suffering produces character. Character. If you want to be a person who suffers well, you're going to live with great character. You'll have integrity and honesty and compassion and mercy, conviction, diligence, persistence, love, patience, kindness, right? All of those things will come out of your life. Last, Paul even writes, he says, we know that character produces hope. If you suffer well, you will become a person who is hopeful. What a great thing that is. You might think that suffering would wreck us, right? That suffering would ruin us. You think, how many times can you lose your job in your life and still become a person who says, not only can I do good work, but then I can even be of a benefit to others. It's the hardest thing to learn to say. That somehow this event that I'm experiencing will serve for the good of others. But we look in the scriptures and we see over and over that the suffering that people experienced did lead them to hope. When Abraham had to sacrifice his son, that wasn't a pleasant experience for him to go through. But as he did so, he could look to the future and say, God will make me into a great nation. And he was filled with hope because of it. That's the last thing. So there's just 5 basic things that you and I will exhibit, will show if we learn how to suffer well. Why? Why should we do all of this? First, you and I need to know that if we suffer well, if we're going to suffer well, that there's got to be some reason for it. When you go through all of the problems you go through, when you go through all of the agony you go through, and you have to say to yourself, I have no idea why this is happening. If you're going to suffer, you've got to know that there's a reason for it. And Paul said the same thing, or God said the same thing to us. We heard it today from Acts. We know that the main reason we can trust God in our suffering is in the midst of our suffering, God Himself did the same for us. If nothing else, the reason that we suffer is so that God can point us to the sufferings of Christ, the one who took it all on Himself, so that He could redeem us from our sufferings and make a great world for us. An eternal world that will never be taken away, a home that will never have any more crying or sorrow or pain, but a world where we will live forever in perfect bliss with our Father. Now that is a world that I wait for, because I am tired of the job loss, and I'm tired of the heartaches, and I'm tired of the arguments, and I'm tired of people walking away and the disappointments and the failures and all of the other agony of our lives. But I also take great joy and a little bit of comfort, and I bet you do too, in the little moments that we do get to see where God has used suffering to work incredible good in this world. I would bet that behind, and I know, behind the fall of the Berlin Wall, behind the end of apartheid, behind the end of the communist regime, behind the growth of connections between North Korea and South Korea, behind all of these great events in the world, you can find praying Christians, Christians who have called out to God and said, God, come and help us, rescue us, save us in this time of need. And we get to see then the end of some suffering. It might just be a little bit, but we call and we wait and we get to see a little piece of it because we know someday then God will wipe it all away. One of my favorite examples is Eric Liddell. You might know Eric Liddell and his story from Chariots of Fire. Eric Liddell was this great runner who refused to run in the Olympics on Sunday, and after he did, then he had to run a different race that he normally ran, and he ended up decimating the competition, and he won a medal for himself. But he was also famous in my book because he was a missionary. And after he ran in the Olympics and he won the Olympics, he ended up going to China. He was arrested by the Japanese when the Japanese invaded China. He was placed with a number of other missionaries and foreigners in this place called the Shantung Compound. As he spent his time in the Shantung Compound, he was known for putting on activities for the kids. He was known for providing aid and care for the sick people in the bunks. He was known for managing the conflict that arose in the camp and just generally providing assistance to everybody in need. And one man commented about him and the time that he spent in the camp. And if you ever think, if there's going to be a place where people will act terribly, it would be in a prison war camp. But one man commented about him and the other Christians that there was a quality that was unique to him and the group. Namely, that naturally and without pretense to respond to a need, which everybody else recognized, only to turn away from it, This quality, if there was any evidence of the grace of God observable on our camp, they were to be found there. Eric and the others lived with a Christian life, and it brought grace to that camp, and it was part of the end of that camp as well as many others. That is where you and I get to see the suffering of our lives bear fruit. And I pray that the suffering in your lives would show the same.